Come now to our next presentation on the book of Daniel. As you recall, in our last study period, we looked at the 8th chapter briefly and saw the ram and the he-goat. The ram coming first and the he-goat following after as a great destroying power that destroyed the ram completely. We have now a picture of these two beasts to give you another conception of what they look like. First of all, the ram with two horns that moved with great speed across the earth and became great, followed by the he-goat with one horn who came upon the ram and destroyed him utterly and completely. Now, the Bible leaves no doubt as to who the ram represents, or in turn the he-goat. Let's come back to Daniel chapter 8 again to find out the identity of these two great powers. Daniel chapter 8, and begin by looking together at verse 20. The ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn between his eyes is the first king. So clearly then, Medo-Persia, the twin-horned ram, was symbolised by the twin-horned ram, and Greece was symbolised by the he-goat or male goat, and the great horn between his eyes was the first king, whose name of course was Alexander the Great, very well known and very famous too. And then verse 22 says, as for the broken horn and the four which stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. And subsequent to the death of Alexander the Great, we find that 4 generals took over his empire. They were Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy and Seleucus, and they reigned in his stead. And then arose the little horn power, which of course symbolised pagan and then papal Rome in turn. Now, coming back to the actual vision part of the presentation, we find that Daniel now, in the very eve of Babylon's downfall, is given a view of a long succeeding continuation of Babylon of God's people. Let's try today to capture something of the picture he saw that day, so we can appreciate the distress which overcame him as he saw these things happen. Now bear in mind, as I said before, we'll start a line across the board again. In 538 BC, before Christ, that's 500 years or a little more, we come to the actual fall of Babylon. And in the very eve of that fall, God gave to Daniel this view, of which is now recorded in what we call Daniel chapter 8. And no doubt Daniel, who understood the prophecy of Jeremiah, which gave 70 years of Babylonian supremacy, was optimistic and hopeful that with the fall of Babylon, Israel would have learnt their lesson, would have gone back to their own land again, and would have certainly reformed and seen the work of God quickly finished in the world. But instead, God showed him the rise of a great world power called Medo-Persia. And Daniel knew, of course, that world powers do not come upon the scene and depart in a short span of time, like a few weeks or months, but usually last for centuries of time. And then after Medo-Persia was to come Greece, and after Greece was to come this little horn power which we call Rome in its pagan and papal forms, stretching down into the papacy, and time seemed to be going on and on and on and on and on. And so, far down the annals of time, well over 1,000 years away, Daniel was told that this little horn power would again rise up and do all these desperate things to the Church of God. Let's read what they were again in verses, I think about verse 9 down to verse 12. We'll emphasise some of these points very clearly at the present time. And out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. Now, who upon this earth is the host of heaven? And the answer is, of course, the people of God. And who are the stars of that host? The ministers or leaders in the Church of God. And here Daniel saw one of the great essentials for the finishing of the work taken away from God's folk way down here in papal days. Number one, the freedom of God's people was lost to them. They were in bondage to this awesome power. Now, in God's kingdom, we obtain freedom. In fact, the message we bear on the gospel of deliverance is called bondage to freedom. And Jesus said, if the Son therefore shall make you free, you shall be free indeed. John 8 and verse 36. But sin is a bondmaster, and so is Babylon a bondmaster. And wherever Babylon reigns, of course, men are brought into abject bondage and subject to cruelty and oppression. So there's the first essential gone, taken away from God's folk by the little horn power. Now coming to the next verse, we find in verse 11, he even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. Now who is the prince of the host? Right. Jesus Christ. So when a man or a kingdom of men exalt themselves to an equality as high as the prince of the host, they thereby replace the prince of the host with themselves. Don't they? This is a replacement. What's a nice short word we can use to describe that? Yes, it's usurpation. Well, we use the word usurp. They usurp themselves, usurp the position of the prince of the host and make themselves equal to him and thus above and before him. Now verse 11 goes on to say, and by him the daily was taken away and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Now I've dropped out the word sacrifices because this is a word which was not in the original text. When you see in your Bible a word in italics, it means that the word's been supplied because the translator's thought it should be there, not because it was there in the first case. So we find then that the daily is removed, and the daily signifies something continual, something ongoing, something permanent, in this case the actual ministry of Jesus Christ on behalf of sinners. Now when the ministry of Christ on behalf of sinners is taken away, what hope do sinners have? They have no hope whatsoever. Let's go briefly across to Hebrews chapter 7 verse 25 to note a very significant scripture in regard to the ministry of Jesus Christ in the sanctuary up in heaven, which we shall speak a great deal more in the very near future. Hebrews 7 verse 25, therefore he is also able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he ever lives to make intercession for them. Now the word there, he ever lives, has the same idea of continuity, of permanency, of being there as an ever ready, ever available source of salvation from sin. And because Christ is the minister of the true sanctuary, which God pitched and not man, he is able by virtue of this continued ministry to bring salvation to the uttermost to all those that come into God by him. But take away the message on the daily, or the forever ministry of Jesus Christ, then what hope does the blinded soul then have? And the answer is absolutely none. None whatsoever. And the next part of Daniel chapter 8 verse 11 says, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Right? The place of his sanctuary was cast down. You just put the word sanctuary here to cover that point. We'll now read a little further to note the final work of this substitute power, this abomination of desolation. Daniel chapter 8 and we now come to verse 12. Because of transgression, an army was given him over to the horn to oppose it daily. He cast truth to the ground, and he did all this and prospered. So finally we find that an army was given to him, and I just put the word truth here. He cast truth to the ground, and he practiced, and he prospered. I'd like to emphasise again, and it's very important we acknowledge the fact that Babylon's ways do bring prosperity for a start. They do provide those who use these systems with exaltation, with wealth, with power, with dominion, with seeming permanency. Babylon does prosper initially, but this prosperity is followed by a fall so climactic and tragic and complete that she never ever looks like rising again. This is the way it was with old Babylon, and this is the way it shall be with the new Babylon, which is rising up again in these last days. Let's turn to Revelation chapter chapter 18, I believe it to be, yes. Chapter 18, where we read about the final fate of modern Babylon as she again rises to prosperity. First, you find in this chapter that Babylon proclaims her glorious marriage, that she's no widow, that she has all things where she wants them, and then the awesome result of this will fall. Revelation chapter 18, and we'll look at verse 6, 7 and 8. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works, in the cup which she has mixed for her double. In the measure that she has glorified herself and lived luxuriously. Now, does that sound like prosperity? She has lived luxuriously. In the same measure give her torment and sorrow, for she says in her heart, I sit as queen and am no widow, and will not see sorrow. Therefore her place will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she'll be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judges her. This is the picture of Babylon. Days of glorious prosperity, days of wonderful power, days of seeming impregnability, days when nothing at all seems to reach her or to cause her to suffer. And then suddenly, unexpectedly, in one single day, comes her demise. If you cast your mind back to Belshazzar's feast on that eventful night, Belshazzar with 1,000 of his lords was eating and drinking in his palace, seemingly there forever, powerful, impregnable, mighty, rich, wealthy, and so on. And when the sun went down, there seemed to be no indication at all of that city's fate. By next morning, it was just a smoking ruin. And so we read in the last verse of Revelation chapter 18, the picture of Babylon's future and final fall, verse 21 to 24. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found any more. Now, what is the bottom of the ocean? Well, first of all, how deep are the oceans? They're miles deep in places, aren't they? Miles deep. And down there on the bottom, what do you expect to find? Many hundreds of feet of mud. When you throw a millstone into the sea and it goes down, hits that mud, what does it do? It disappears into the mud. The mud closes over it and levels off again, and what hope do you have of ever seeing that thing again? It's gone. It's unfindable. Stone, for instance, doesn't respond to metal detectors or anything at all. You just can't find it. It's gone, never to be found again. Such is the future of modern Babylon. Verse 22 of Revelation chapter 18, the sound of harpists, musicians, flautists and trumpeters shall not be heard in you any more, and no craftsman of any craft shall be found in you any more, and the sound of millstones shall not be heard in you any more, and the light of a lamp shall not shine in you any more, and the voice of bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you any more. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery all nations were deceived. And in whom is found the blood of prophets and saints of all who were slain on the earth. Now, could you ask for a picture of a more total and permanent destruction than is pictured in those words? You couldn't. And of a more sudden destruction, could you picture it? Impossible. That is the future fate of modern Babylon. So while we recognise that today Babylon's ways do bring immediate prosperity and power, there's coming a very sudden and climactic destruction of her in the very near future, not at God's hand so much as but rather the result of her own harvest of the seed she herself has sown. We may sit back rather smugly and say to ourselves, well, that's the fate of the Roman Catholic Church, and certainly is. Now, I'm not a Roman Catholic, I'm a good Protestant. But the simple facts of these, that Babylon is a term which describes any attempt on man's part to build God's kingdom man's way. And if you're seeking to build your own personal empire, man's way, you're a Babylonian. And as surely as you are, and remain such, you'll suffer the fate of all Babylonians and Babylon herself. You come to utter and great desolation. Now, the full impact of the picture in Daniel 8 becomes more apparent. We understand the sanctuary and its significance in the work of God. But for the moment, let me make the point that while the people of God are denied their freedom, while a usurper sits upon the throne of God upon this earth, while we're denied the daily ministry of Jesus Christ in the sanctuary, while the sanctuary itself is cast in and truth is hidden from view, most certainly God's work cannot be finished in this old world of sin. That's impossible. Now, Daniel could look back to the days of Joshua. So let's take our line of time from the time of Daniel's vision right back to the days of Joshua when he first entered the Promised Land. And when they entered the Promised Land and became established there, did they have their freedom? Were they a free people? They certainly were. Did they have a usurper in God's place in their lives? No. Did they have the daily services to give them victory over sin? They did. Did they have the sanctuary in their midst and the truth of God amongst them? Right, they had all those things. And thus equipped, they were to do battle with the enemies of God. Unfortunately, not with a sword necessarily, although unfortunately they did take the sword, but God had better ways than that. And their task was to spread out until they had literally occupied the entire world and filled it with the righteousness of God. I'd like to read a description. This is given in a book called Prophets and Kings, a commentary on the history of the Jews from the days of Samuel, more or less, on through to David and Solomon, Daniel, and beyond that. And in discussing the role of Israel, I'll read these words on page 19. The children of Israel were to occupy all the territory which God appointed them. Those nations that rejected the worship and service of the true God will be dispossessed. But it was God's purpose that by the revelation of his character through Israel, men should be drawn unto him. To all the world the gospel invitation was to be given. Through the teaching of the sacrificial service, Christ was to be uplifted before the nations, and all who look upon him should live. All who, like Rahab the Canaanite and Ruth the Moabitess, turned from idolatry to the worship of the true God, will unite themselves with his chosen people. As the numbers of Israel increased, they were to enlarge their borders until their kingdom should embrace the world. But ancient Israel did not fulfill God's purpose. The Lord declared, I have planted thee a noble vine, wholly a right seed. How then art thou turned into the degenerate plant of a strange vine unto me? Israel is an empty vine, he bringeth forth fruit unto himself. And there are many more scriptures, of course, which picture what Israel ought to have been, but failed to be. And the sad history of the past was one in which, subsequent to Joshua's death, Israel, which had climbed to a very high pinnacle of power and strength, fell into very deep and tragic apostasy. And when they did, of course, they became weaker than the nations around about them. Now, in this warfare, to be waged between the people of God, we should add one more thought here, and that is this, that the daily ministration involved the funneling or channeling or supply of God's awesome power to Israel. Now, when Israel was equipped with the power of God, and Satan and his forces were denied the power of God, then with all the equipment Israel had, what ought to have been the outcome every time in their struggle between themselves and the enemy? Victory for Israel, every time. Now, there were some victories, and when they were made, they were very total, very complete. For instance, when Israel went to war against Jericho, how many soldiers or casualties did Israel experience? Not a single one. That's extraordinary, isn't it? When they fought the little town of Ai the second time, how many casualties? None. And each of those battles against the Hivites and the Philistines and the Perizzites and so on, no casualties in time after time after time. In other words, with God, Israel could not lose even a single soldier. That's real victory, isn't it? There's complete and perfect victory. And you think that when they saw the effect of their true walk with God and their triumph over their enemies, they would have always stayed in the sensible right paths, and we wonder, we marvel, it's an amazing thing that they turned away from God to slip into apostasy and defeat. Because when they apostatized, what did they lose? They lost their freedom, and they had a usurper over them, and they lost the daily, they lost their sanctuary, they lost the truth, they lost their God. Now, freedom is one of the most precious gifts mankind can ever know, and men will give their lives to ensure freedom for their wives and children and their nation. And yet they took a course of action which condemned them to bondage to their enemies and bondage to sin. And then when they felt the weight of the oppressor and remembered the sweetness of their previous freedoms, they called to God for deliverance. And what did God give them every single time? Deliverance. And when God brought them back again through a judge like, shall we say, Samson or Jephthah or Deborah or Barak or one of those men, Gideon, he gave them back their freedom, took away the usurper, replaced the daily, the sanctuary and the truth of God, and once again they walked with him. But for how long? Just a short period of time. Once again they fell away. Once again they cried for deliverance, and so it was an up and down picture in all the centuries of the past. And while this continuing desolation took place, this repeated deprivation of all those things, their freedom, the daily, the sanctuary and the truth of God and the presence of God, obviously, of course, the work of God in the earth could not be finished. Now, Daniel, looking back over the centuries, saw this very disheartening picture of what had taken place. And it was a disheartening picture. In fact, when you look today, if we go down to 1987, which is the year in which we're living at the present time, for the date only just a date for the moment, 1987, as we look back over something like 4,000 and 5,000 years, close to between 4,000 and 5,000 years of this same miserable picture of a people who had so much, giving it all up in favour of sin, losing their place with God. When we think of the long, grim years of the Dark Ages, is it not even today a very disheartening picture? Isn't it? And we find ourselves asking a very obvious question: how long? Now, Daniel was not at the end as we are, but in the middle is where he stood. And looking back, you see this long, sad pattern. And looking forward in the light of Bible prophecy, as given here in Daniel, the 8th chapter, what did the future have for him? A continuation of the same miserable picture as they'd had in the past. Now, Daniel was an extraordinary Christian. He was a mighty man of God. He was a man of impeccable integrity, a man whose righteousness was excellent, a man who had extremely strong and deep feelings about the cause of God, a man whose whole life was committed to and wrapped up in the cause of God. It was his very breath day by day. And so as he looked back and saw this oppression, and for to see the same, he felt this as probably you and I have never felt it. And consequently he asked the question in verse 13, or the question was asked on his behalf by an angel, a revelator of this vision. How long, this is verse 13 of Daniel chapter 8, how long will the vision be? Concerning the daily and the transgressed of desolation, to give the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. Now, we must recognise, of course, the nature of this question. There were times back here when the sanctuary had not been trampled underfoot, right? There were days of glory. There were days of freedom. There were days when the sanctuary was in its rightful place, cleansed and doing its ministry. And likewise, subsequent to the rise of pagan Rome, there were times when the people of God did have some freedom. The usurper was put aside. They had the daily, the sanctuary and the truth. What the question is really asking, when will the sanctuary on a permanent basis be set eternally free? Right? When will there become a cessation to this success, failure, or victory and apostasy pattern of the past? And the answer was, under 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, having given the vision down to verse 14, We now have the explanation or interpretation of it, which we looked at already to a point. So I want to come down in the explanation part to the point, to the place where it starts to talk about the actual time period of the prophecy. Verse 26, and the evenings, and the vision of the evenings and the morning, which was told is true. Therefore, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. Now, that is not an explanation of the 2,300-day portion of the prophecy. It was an attempt to explain it. It was the beginning of an interpretation, but not the interpretation itself. Now, let's go back a moment to note the commission of Gabriel, the mighty angel sent by God to interpret the vision for Daniel. We find this back in verse 16. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near. Now, did the commissioner, the director, the one giving the command to Gabriel, say, make him understand part of the vision? Or most of the vision? What did he say? Understand the vision. So how much of it was the angel commissioned to explain to Daniel? All of it. Now we find that he told what the ram was, namely Medo-Persia, what the he-goat was, namely Grecia, what the first horn was, namely Alexander the Great, what the four horns were. The first horn was Alexander the Great. The four horns were the four generals or divisions of his empire, and the little horn, of course, was the man of sin, the great ongoing papal system. But there's no explanation given here of the 2,300-day prophecy or time period in the prophecy. So what must we expect then? To find it somewhere else. We must expect that, and we shall not be disappointed, not for one moment. So let's now leave that explanation for the moment though. I want to note another point here, and that is this. The reason for this explanation not being given at this point is because it became too much for Daniel to endure. Verse 27, and I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterwards arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished at the vision, but no one understood it. He was astonished at the vision. It was an amazing thing to him, and nobody else was able to understand the vision at all, even though he revealed it to them and talked about it to them as well. And I suppose too that at this point, Daniel himself was quite uncertain as to what the 2,300-day prophecy actually meant, what it was all about, and left him amazed and astonished. Now, there was a time when I was quite distressed by the fact that the actual explanation was not given here in Daniel chapter 8, I beg your pardon, but was given in the next chapter, namely chapter 9. Because so many people today out in the Protestant world are claiming that they're two separate and unrelated prophecies. Daniel chapter 8 dealing with Antiochus Epiphanes before Christ came, and Daniel 9 dealing with the coming man of sin at the end of the age. But I wish to demonstrate today that I'm very glad now that these two prophecies were slightly separated, because by being kept apart, they answered two questions with the one answer, and that's a very helpful thing in this respect. God left Daniel to pray about this thing for several months, to worry about it, to think about it, to study it without giving him the answers, which God does do at times. It heightens our sense of need and makes us much more receptive to the truth when God's time for his revelation has come. And in Daniel chapter 9 we find that a new empire has been born in the meantime. Let's look at Daniel chapter 9 verse 1. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years, specified by the word of the Lord, given to Jeremiah the prophet, who had accomplished 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. In other words, as I said before, The revelation given in Daniel chapter 8 took place in the very year when Belshazzar fell and Babylon with him. Now in the first year of Darius we come to the message provided for us in Daniel the 9th chapter. What caused Daniel to be so prayerful and so concerned at this point of time was the fact that whereas the prophecy of Jeremiah 25 verse 12 had foretold 70 years of Babylonian supremacy, and that supremacy was now broken, but Israel was not at that point of time set free, nor was any sign of her at this point of time being set free. And furthermore, the prospects of being set free were rather difficult to see, because what world conqueror is about to release a whole nation of very, very efficient and effective slaves? Well, I shouldn't quite say slaves, but the Jews in Babylon were not slaves as they were back in Egypt. They had business in their own rights, but they were a very significant part of the economy. And while in Babylon, I beg your pardon, they certainly were under Babylonian control and could be kept from insurrection and uprisings and assaults against the government. Whereas given back their own land again, their own economy, they would soon become again a threat to the Medo-Persian power structure. So the appearances said that there was no hope at the present time of Israel being set free to go back to their own land again, but rather that the bondage would go on for quite some time yet. And so Daniel then feared that Israel had failed to repent sufficiently to enable God to bring about the deliverance. So you find he prayed then this wonderful confession of prayer in regard to the deliverance of Israel, not the 2,300 days at this point. Now, we shan't take time to read this marvellous prayer. I do suggest you do so in your own spare time and study periods. It begins in verse 4 and runs on down to verse 19. And it's a prayer of very deep confession on Daniel's part in regard to the sins of Israel and their need to come back into oneness with God again. And then in verse 20 we find that an angel appears, no other person than Gabriel himself by name. Now while I was speaking, praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplications before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering. And he informed me and talked with me and said, "O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand. At the beginning of your supplication, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore consider the matter and understand the vision." When we pray for rich blessings from God, we usually get more than we ask for, don't we? Higher than the highest human thought can reach is God to deal with his children, and he knows far better than we do what our needs actually are. And here we find Daniel praying. His whole attention was focused upon the future of his own people and their deliverance from the land of Babylon by Medo-Persian power. But God came to give him an answer in regard to that point, and also in regard to the 2,300 days and the ultimate future of his people, the final deliverance of his people. And for this reason the angel said, let's read the words carefully again in the last part of that last verse, "Therefore consider the matter and understand the vision." Two things here are under consideration. Now, what was the matter on Daniel's mind at this point of time? The deliverance of Israel, the 70 years of captivity in Babylon, and the return of Israel back to their own promised land again, and their future in that land. How long would they continue to be God's true people? Would they at last learn their lesson and come out to make an end of sins, to bring in everlasting righteousness and to finish transgression? Or just what was their future? And then the angel said, and understand the vision. Now, was the matter on Daniel's mind a vision? Did God, through Jeremiah, reveal the message by way of a vision? No, he didn't. By the word of God, right? Now, God's communication to his prophets comes in two ways in particular. One is by giving that man a vision, which is much rarer than the other way, which is where God spoke to him directly and said, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet saying, or to Isaiah, or whatever. And in Daniel's case, every message came by what means? By a vision and by a dream. Daniel 2, 7, 8, 11, 10, and also chapter 12. They're all visions that came to him. But when you go through the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, and so on, you'll find that more frequently God spoke to the men by simply talking to them, and he would say, the word of the Lord came to me saying. And that's not a vision, that's a direct communication. If you go back to Jeremiah 25 verse 12, you'll find there in that chapter God spoke to Jeremiah not through a vision but directly by his own direct word. Therefore, when the angel said, understand the vision, he could not be referring back to Jeremiah. That's quite out of the question. But to what must he have been referring? To the unexplained portion of Daniel chapter 8. It could be nothing else but that. And when we come to see that all the word that came from Gabriel, the messenger at this point of time, concerned time periods, we are then, of course, justified in realising that this is a further detail in regard to the 2,300 days. Now, let's look at what the angel had to say. He said, 70 weeks are determined upon you. I tend to quote the old King James. I'll read the New King James now. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up wisdom and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. What is another word to use in place of determined? Allotted, right? Apportioned. Any more words like that we can use? Set aside, determined, pardon? Cut off, right? Cut off, apportioned. So the angel said, now, for your people and for your holy city, which is Jerusalem, 70 weeks have been set aside, cut off, apportioned. Now, very obviously, of course, this apportioning must be from a much larger period of time. If you cut a portion of a piece of cake, you have most of the cake left, don't you? Just the one piece is cut out. Now, this period of time was apportioned to do certain things. One, to finish the transgression. Number two, to make an end of sins. Three, to make reconciliation for iniquity. Four, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Once again, I emphasise the point that when we come to understand the purpose of God's ministry in the sanctuary above, and to realise that when and only when transgression is finished, sin is ended, everlasting righteousness brought in, that only then can the sanctuary be cleansed, and only then can the work of God be finished in this old world of sin. But what God told Daniel through Gabriel was this, that inside the span of 70 prophetic weeks, 70 weeks of years, as some translations put it, Israel was to be given the final opportunity, her last chance, to rise up to her destiny and finish the work as God would have it finished. But inside that 70-week period, which of course is 490 years altogether, Israel could have made an end of sins, could have finished transgression, could have brought in everlasting righteousness, and could thus have seen the end of Babylon's reign forever and forever. Now we ask ourselves the question, we today are of course a long way beyond the end of that 490-year period, which ended back in 34 AD. We're well over almost 2,000 years from that point of time. And let's look around ourselves and ask ourselves the question, is sin ended yet? First of all, in the lives of God's true people. Have we all become sinless yet? We haven't, have we? Has transgression been finished in the lives of God's people yet? Not yet. Has everlasting righteousness been brought in? Not yet. And what about the world around about us? Is it out there? Is even farther than the truth out there? So therefore, Israel did not succeed in doing what she might have done during that 490-year period. She didn't do it. And because she did not do it, it must be left to another people, because that work must be done before Christ can return, and Christ is going to come back again. That's for certain. So let's look now at a little sequence of events as follows. We'll work our way backwards here. We put down first of all the actual advent of Jesus Christ. That must be preceded by the cleansing of the sanctuary and the final disposition of all the sins of God's people. And that cleansing cannot take place until an end is made of sins, transgression is finished, and everlasting righteousness is brought in. It can't be done. Now you'll notice that God said through Gabriel to Daniel that 70 weeks have been set aside so that you might do this. God didn't say they would do it, he said that you might do it. And knowing they would not do it, even though they're given every opportunity to do it, God said back in the prophecy, in reply to the question, how long? Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, if God declared in solemn terms that under 2,300 days then shall the sanctuary be cleansed, will it be cleansed? Absolutely. The time will come when the final cleansing will take place. We'll demonstrate later, of course, that the cleansing as far as the sins of the dead are concerned is already in progress, and for the living is coming up very, very shortly. Now, when God said unto 2,000 days, then he was saying, there will come a time when I have upon this earth a people in whose lives sin has been ended, a people in whom transgression has been finished, a people in whom everlasting righteousness has been established, a people who confess sin no more at all forever, no more confession of sin. In other words, the time will come when there will cease to be a stream of sin flowing into the sanctuary, and that stream being stopped at its source in the very heart of the believer, so that no more sin enters, no more confession, no more sin enters the sanctuary. Then that building can be cleansed and the work of God will be finished. All that's involved in the declaration, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And we'll look more particularly at the sanctuary service in our coming study periods to demonstrate the practical terms of this great mission on God's part. So we have the certainty, especially we live right down at the very end of time, that very soon God will have such a people, and our personal responsibility now is to ensure that the stream of sin is stopped from your heart. That's your responsibility, and mine from my heart. That we'll no longer have to confess sin because of perfect righteousness, and that everlasting righteousness has been established in our hearts and lives. Now, during the past, you finished? No. During the past 6,000 years, God's people have failed to measure up to the simple requirements. And now there rests upon this present generation the responsibility of doing what has not been done in the past, namely of so laying hold upon the living gospel of Jesus Christ that every sin shall be confessed and put away, everlasting righteousness brought in and that to stay, so that the stream of sin that flows from us by confession in the sanctuary is stopped. And when that is stopped, then the cleansing of the sanctuary can take place and the end of all things be brought about. This is our responsibility and this is our privilege. May we rise to the occasion as they have not done in the past, is my prayer today.